Hello everyone and welcome to the second lecture for Between War and Peace. This week we're going to be looking at just war theory. So in the previous lecture I introduced the course and gave an account of the responsibility to protect doctrine, the R2P. Remember that this is the predominant frame, the responses to mass atrocities are now framed. This week we're going to consider just war theory. We do so for two reasons. The first is because just war theory helps us to understand what is wrong with war and the need for the alternatives. So we're going to look at the critique of war implied by just war theory. The second is because just war theory provides a very clear, intuitively attractive and useful set of criteria. We can use these criteria that we're going to look at this week to help us assess the alternatives in later weeks. So the concepts that we're going to consider today are going to be useful for later lectures and later seminars when we explore the alternatives to war. Now, the main aims of today's lectures are firstly to outline the central principles of just war theory, and in particular the principles of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. They are secondly to understand why just war theorists don't think that war is morally justified in many cases, and their call to pursue the alternatives, particularly through the principle of last resort. Now, I understand that some of you might have already looked or considered just war theory before, such as in previous modules, such as in arguing about politics. Today's lecture is going to be a bit different. It will approach the topic from a different angle. It will and hopefully it will be able to be followed by those of you who haven't studied just war theory as well before. Now, to explain what just war theory is, I want you to think about the intervention in Libya in 2011. It started in the context of the Arab Spring with uprisings against the rule of Colonel Gaddafi. Gaddafi appeared to crack down on the protesters very harshly and threatened in particular the citizens of Benghazi. In response, the UK, France and US led a bombing campaign with the authorization of the UN Security Council. The campaign became controversial as it was alleged that first, the coalition did not take sufficient precaution in avoiding harm to civilians. The second main controversy was that it was alleged the intervention became not simply about protecting civilians, but rather regime change, getting rid of Gaddafi. Now, this intervention was and continues to be fairly controversial for these reasons. The Foreign Affairs Select Committee report, House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee, was very critical of it, largely for these reasons. Now, I want you to think about two issues. First, was the situation in Libya sufficiently serious to warrant military intervention, to warrant war, humanitarian intervention? Now, the just war theorist Michael Walzer, who we're going to be looking at today, doubted this. He argued that a military attack of the sort now in progress is only defensible in the most extreme cases. But on the other hand, one might think that the situation was sufficiently serious, given that according to some, Gaddafi appeared to indicate that his regime intended to commit massacre in his now famous No Mercy speech, which he called on his supporters to go out and cleanse the city of Benghazi. Now, I also want you to think about how much it matters if the intention of the regime, the intention of the coalition was regime change to get rid of Gaddafi, rather than trying to protect threatened civilians. How much does its intention matter? The dangers of regime change are generally greater than interventions to protect civilians. But you might still think that regime changes, wars to initiate regime change, are sometimes permissible, necessary to secure the protection of civilians. Thirdly, the intervention in Libya largely relied on air power. This reliance on air power is highly controversial. On the one hand, there were no reported NATO casualties, but on the other, an investigation in 2011 by the New York Times of the airstrikes found that at least 40 civilians and perhaps more than 70 were killed by NATO at these sites. I've got a short video to illustrate some of the issues here.
Next, two takes on the war in Libya, beginning with the latest bombing by NATO forces. Angus Walker of Independent Television News reports from Tripoli.
For half an hour, NATO airstrikes blasted targets near Colonel Gaddafi's compound. It was the heaviest bombardment of central Tripoli for more than 2 weeks. NATO said it hit a vehicle compound used for resupplying Gaddafi's troops. Libyan government officials took camera crews to a nearby hospital, showing reporters 3 dead and claiming 150 were injured.
We have 3 martyrs so far. The injured have been taken to 2 different hospitals. This is one of them. Some of them, of course, were treated and they have gone home already because of their light injuries. Some have bigger, more serious injuries. Some have died, of course, as you have seen.
NATO has been expanding its range of targets in central Tripoli, hitting Colonel Gaddafi's fortified compound, intelligence headquarters, and naval vessels in the city's harbour. The bombing campaign is into its 3rd month, and yet the Libyan regime clings onto power. NATO rejects claims that it has lost momentum. Now it's understood that if the decision is taken, 3 Apache helicopters on board HMS Ocean in the Mediterranean will go into action. Another 2 are on standby in the UK. The helicopters are expected to enforce a 16-mile buffer zone around Misrata to prevent Libyan artillery hitting the recently besieged city. NATO is trying to find a way to finish what it started.
Now, is it acceptable to cause some unintended civilian casualties if they are unavoidable when trying to secure morally valuable, worthy ends, such as tackling mass atrocities? Or should one refrain from killing innocents, even if this means that one doesn't intervene, doesn't do anything, and then even more people die? Well, just war theory helps us to answer these sorts of questions. It helps us to judge whether war in a particular instance was just. It helps us to determine whether NATO, for instance, had just cause to wage war in Libya, and whether regime change is an acceptable intention. It also helps to provide guidance for how war should be carried out, such as how much care interveners must take when confronting bombing campaigns. In short, it provides a set of moral restrictions, ethical restrictions for warfare. Now, some of you might immediately be thinking that the idea of a just war that provides moral restrictions on war is crazy, bizarre. Surely war is always wrong. Alternatively, how can there be any restrictions on war? After all, remember the famous proverb, all is fair in love and war. Now, these are 2 extreme positions. At one extreme is pacifism. On the pacifist position, war is never justified. Regardless of the evil that you are confronting, pacifism requires you to refrain from waging war. So, on the pacifist approach, it was wrong to intervene in Kosovo, despite the impending ethnic cleansing of the Kosovan Albanians. Wrong to launch the first Gulf War to restore Kuwait's sovereignty, and wrong to launch World War II against the Nazis. Now, we're going to consider various forms of pacifism in week 5, and some do step a little bit back from these claims. But for now, to simplify, most leading versions of pacifism reject the notion that war could, in current circumstances, be justified. At the other extreme is realism. On a realist position, anything goes in war, providing that it's in the national interest. So South Africa, for instance, would do nothing wrong if it invaded Eswatini, a country formerly known as Swaziland, if this would be in the national interests of South Africa. And there aren't any restrictions on what it can do during war when invading Eswatini. It could specifically target women and children if this would help to ensure a particularly quick surrender. By contrast, just war theory argues that there are limitations on when and how we can wage war, but accepts that waging war is sometimes right and at other times wrong. Just war theory can be seen then as a midway between realism and pacifism. Unlike realism, it does not hold that anything goes in war, and unlike pacifism, it holds that at certain times war can be justified. What I want to highlight in particular for today's lecture, for what we're going to be looking at in this module, is that in being a midway between realism and pacifism, it provides a critique of war. It says that all wars are not morally permissible. Some are morally problematic. And in particular, they are morally problematic because they fail to meet certain criteria. This brings us to the next slide. So just war theory outlines certain principles or restrictions on first, when we can wage war, second, what we can do during war, and third, what we can do after war. The first type of restriction relates to the right to make war, to launch war. These are criteria for when we can justifiably go to war. These are called the principles of jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum. It's important to try and remember these Latin names. They're going to crop up throughout the readings. Try and get them right when you're thinking about them, if you think about doing an essay or an exam of them. Get these Latin criteria right. Jus ad bellum, before war. Jus in bello, second type of restriction. These concerned what it's permissible to do when waging war, during war, in bello, in war. For instance, the killing of civilians intentionally is prohibited. The third set of criteria relates to what can be done justifiably after war. So if the war is successful, there are limitations on how states should behave as victors. And these are the principles of jus post bellum, post-war, after war. For instance, you could not put extremely harsh terms on the defeated party, extracting from them huge financial penalties, which would be unfair, potentially lead to another war again. So the relevance of jus post bellum is that it tries to prevent future wars and tries to make a more just state that is now being potentially occupied by the victor. Whether just war post bellum is a key part of the tradition is somewhat debated amongst just war theorists. And I'm not going to say much about jus post bellum today. One of the issues is that jus post bellum isn't really about war. It's about what goes on after war. So it's less relevant for what we're thinking about in this module. Okay, let me now make 4 more points. Just war theory has a very long, rich historical pedigree, starting from medieval Christian thinkers, such as St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, including very influential thinkers such as Hugo Grotius and Immanuel Kant, extending more recently to prominent modern day thinkers such as Michael Walzer, famous traditionalist in the traditionalist camp, and Jeff McMahon, going to get onto the second part of the lecture, famous for being in the revisionist camp. Now, just war theory, as I've already alluded to, is called a tradition. This is because there's been certain convergence around the specific principles that should govern war. But that said, although there is some agreement around the principles that I'm going to run through today, I want you to bear in mind that just war theorists have a lot of disagreement about, firstly, which principles are more important than others, and secondly, how we should understand these principles. So throughout the ages, they've offered their own accounts of the principles, their own justifications of them, and their own rejections sometimes of them. This brings me to the second point. Just war theory is a very broad church. There are, in effect, different wings of just war theory. There are some just war theorists who are closer to realism. I put up here, Eshstein, famous defender of the Iraq War. There are some just war theorists much closer to pacifism. Above me is a picture of Cécile Fabre, whose work features quite a lot on this module, much closer to pacifism. They believe, people closer to pacifist side of it, that the restrictions of war are very restrictive. Most wars are unjust and only a few are permissible. Those closer to the realist wing tend to be much more permissive about the restrictions on states going to war. Think that there are restrictions on states, but these are far less demanding. On to the third point. Until recently, just war theory was largely viewed as a Western and specifically Catholic tradition. But with moves to decolonize the subject and to study non-Western approaches, scholars have been increasingly recognizing that just war theory also has a very rich non-Western basis as well. There are forms of just war theory or the ethics of war, more generally in, for instance, African political theory, Confucianism, Buddhism, Islam, Indian traditions, Orthodox Christianity, to name a few. Indeed, there's a very interesting recent book that I've added to the reading list this year, only just out, that I put on order for the library, hopefully be in soon, that explores some of the various just war theorists around the world. You will also find on the reading list books specifically on just war theory and Islam and just war. I'll give you a couple of examples. Firstly, the example of African theory of just war. This emphasizes the notion of harmony and communal bonds between citizens. And from this, there develops an account of just war theory that, according to Thaddeus Metz, that emphasizes waging war in collective self-defense to help other societies under threat. It also has other elements as well. So Metz quotes Nelson Mandela from his book, The Long Walk to Freedom, about the decision to found Spear of the Nation, the military wing of the ANC. Mandela says, violence would begin whether we initiate it or not. Would it not be better to guide this violence ourselves, according to principles where we save lives by attacking symbols of oppression and not people? This is a core element of certain strands of just war theory. War is likely, so it's better sometimes to guide it rather than to eschew all moral principles. Mandela also says in the famous Rivione trial that it was only when all else had failed, when channels of peaceful protest had been barred to us, that the decision was made to embark on violent forms of political struggle. Here we see his endorsement of the principle of something like the last resort, again, which I've already mentioned we're going to be looking at later today. Let me give you a second example here. Confucianism. In the Confucian tradition, Mencius offers the richest account of just war theory. And according to Mencius, the paradigmatic case for just war was a war of rebellion to secure the needs of the people or humanitarian intervention, similarly to secure the rights of the people. For Mencius, states with sufficiently bad governance were legitimate targets of intervention. They didn't have sovereignty as a bar to intervening. Now, this is very similar to what we looked at last week, the notion of responsibility to protect. This, recall, says that states that fail to protect their populations from mass atrocities forfeit their sovereignty, it's temporarily suspended, and states can intervene to tackle the mass atrocities. Okay, so we've looked at three more general points about just war theory. Let me finish with a fourth one before I turn to the principles. As I've said, central are these principles of jus ad bellum, jus in bello. The critique of war implied by just war theory is that war is wrong is because it doesn't meet these criteria. So it's wrong because, for instance, it lacks just cause. It's wrong because, for instance, it violates the principle of discrimination, kills non-combatants. So I'm just going to spell out the criteria that just war theorists say that war needs to meet in order to be just. But bear in mind that many of them think that wars will typically not meet these criteria, and this is what explains why they think that war is wrong. So let's now examine the principles of just war. Just war theorists tend to come up with the same sorts of criteria, remember, although, as I've already said, they tend to disagree on the specifics. So starting with jus ad bellum, principles concerning the pre-war phase, concerns the conditions before war, just about the time they're going to launch war. This is when these criteria apply. For instance, can war be launched only if it's the last resort? Does it need to have the sanction of the UN Security Council? I want to really emphasize this pre-war element because sometimes it gets lost. Imagine that you're replacing Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab, and you've got to decide whether to take military action against North Korea. Suppose that at the time, your intelligence, all your military advisors and cabinet suggests that it would help to tackle the situation, would all meet all the other criteria, wouldn't lead to many casualties, for instance. So you go to war. 5 years down the line, the situation is a complete mess because of events that you could not have predicted. Such as, for instance, a huge natural disaster that fueled a conflict over basic foodstuff. This does not mean necessarily that your original action was wrong. Rather, on the principles of jus ad bellum, it matters whether your decision was right at the time that it was taken, even if things subsequently go wrong that could not have been reasonably foreseen. Now, just war theorists tend to come up with 6 central principles of jus ad bellum, 6 central principles. First is just cause. This is the requirement that there must be a good reason to go to war. So think about the Iraq War in 2003, for instance. Were the circumstances in Iraq, in particular the threat of weapons of mass destruction and Saddam Hussein's tyranny, sufficiently serious in your view? In other words, when is there just cause, circumstances in the target state serious enough to warrant you intervening or waging war in defense against? When is there just cause to wage war? According to Michael Walzer, who's the most prominent just war theorist of recent times, it's only for reasons of self-defense that states can legitimately go to war. So, for instance, if Mali suddenly invades Burkina Faso has just cause to respond to defend its territory. In doing so, Walzer, in his very famous book, Just and Unjust Wars, largely defends the principle of non-intervention. But he accepts that one of the exceptions to the principle of non-intervention are cases of humanitarian intervention. States can intervene in response to the massive violations of basic human rights, in response to what he calls crimes that shock the moral consciousness of mankind. And Waltz's account of just war theory and of humanitarian intervention has been hotly debated. And on the handout, I've listed some papers criticizing Walzer by Doppelt, Beitz, and Luber. At issue is not that humanitarian intervention might potentially be justifiable. According to his critics, Walzer sets the bar far too high. His notion of what constitutes atrocity is very limited, and so the critics argue he allows for too few humanitarian interventions with his notion of crimes that shock the moral consciousness of mankind. Indeed, it's worth noting that Waltz has since revised his position on this in Arguing About War, another book by him, and in the paper Argument About Humanitarian Intervention, where the link is on your handout. He now believes that humanitarian intervention can be acceptable in a greater number of cases. What about R2P? What does R2P say about just cause? Now, R2P, of course, is focused only on humanitarian intervention, not on self-defense, which is the main form of just cause. What does R2P say about just cause of humanitarian intervention? Now, there are two versions of just cause in R2P. One relates to the ISIS doctrine, the old version of R2P, remember. On this, military intervention meets the just cause threshold in circumstances of serious and irreparable harm occurring to human beings or imminently likely to occur, and in particular, actual or apprehended large-scale loss of life or large-scale ethnic cleansing. As we saw last week, this was seen as too permissive by states. This brings us to the second, third iterations of R2P, starting with the second 2005 UN World Summit, and endorsed in the three-pillar approach that holds that states can intervene only in more limited circumstances. And these are when there is a manifest failure to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. This is the form of just cause that's now reiterated. It's now the basis of R2P in its current form. On to the second criterion. Right intention. Those undertaking the war must do so with the right intent and not with an ulterior, perhaps self-interested agenda. What is a right intention? What sort of reasons will states be going to war or intervening for? Well, according to the US Catholic bishops that in the 1980s produced a very influential account of just war theory, war can only be legitimately intended for reasons of just cause. What this means is that if you're going to cite reasons of self-defense, if you're going to be reacting to the just cause of, say, a state attacking your borders, your intention in the war needs to be self-defense. It needs to be, for instance, to fend off that state. Other reasons for waging war, such as revenge, punishment, or financial gain, are precluded. This brings us back to Iraq. So one of the most common objections to the war in Iraq is that the UK and US did not have right intention. The argument has been that although they said that they waged war for reasons of self-defense, to protect themselves against weapons of mass destruction, and although it was claimed that there was also humanitarian justification, given Saddam Hussein's brutal rule, the reasons for actually waging war were very different. For instance, to gain access to Iraqi oil fields. So right intention emphasizes that the reasons for going to war need to be legitimate. and in particular, tied to the just cause. Third criterion, legitimate authority. War needs to be authorized by a legitimate authority, a legitimate body. Again, Iraq. One of the major criticisms of it was that the UK and US went ahead despite the fact that the war lacked UN Security Council authorization. This highlights the importance of this criterion. It says that for war to be justified, those undertaking it need to receive the proper authorization. So it can't be any random group of individuals that go to war. As a class, we can't suddenly decide to wage war on, say, Venezuela or any other state or another module. Only states and certain superstate institutions are those that can permissibly wage war. And when doing so, they need the approval sometimes of relevant international institutions such as the UN Security Council. And they need this particularly for when they're waging wars of humanitarian intervention against other states. Now, there are two queries you might think about this principle. Firstly, you might wonder, why is it morally important, or that it might be legally important, why is it morally important to have the approval of a body such as the UN Security Council? So think about the Kosovo intervention in 1999. NATO led an intervention in Kosovo to try to protect the threatened Kosovan Albanians. The authorization of the intervention in Kosovo was blocked by Russia and China in the Security Council. Russia had close ties with the Milosevic regime and Serbia more in general. Its blocking of the action was largely seen as self-interested. In addition, the UN Security Council has been very heavily criticised, being unrepresentative, no permanent seats from the Global South. UK and France still have seats, despite the fact they're probably seen as fading powers. Not India and Brazil, much larger countries in terms of population size, of course. And the permanent five, UK, Russia, China, the UK and France, get to wield their veto power. So they get to block anything that they choose. One might think that there's not any moral value then in UN Security Council authorization. For instance, because the intervention in Kosovo lacked UN Security Council authorization, it did not render it morally problematic. On the other hand, you might think that it's important to receive UN Security Council authorization because this will help to better maintain international stability and international order. On this line of reasoning, the UN Security Council helps to govern peace and security, and this is important because in the longer run, it can help to protect individuals' basic human rights. To reiterate again, this is particularly relevant for humanitarian interventions, UN Security Council authorization. Let's turn to another query. Why is it that only states should be the ones that be able to legitimately wage war? What about rebel movements? Got a picture here of a famous rebel movement. If only a state can wage war, does this mean that violent rebellion is always impermissible? We might think that sometimes it can be justified to wage a civil war against an oppressive state. Then we might think that only certain forms of rebel groups might be able to permissibly wage war. This raises a further set of interesting, tricky, complex issues. For instance, what do the rebels need to be able to be legitimate? It's much harder for them to be able to be a democracy or have established democratic procedures because, after all, they're a rebel movement, significantly cracked down on. It's hard for them to have very formalized systems. More established groups might have some forms of representation, but it's much harder for spontaneous uprisings. They might commit to being a democracy if they were successful in their war, but why? They might not even need to do that. If they're going to be better than the current form of government, say, which is really genocidal, you might think that they don't need to be committed to a democracy, they just need to be committed to not killing their citizens, their citizens, or violating their basic human rights in other ways. So Alan Buchanan, in his article that's on your handout, the link is on your handout, argues that rebels might sometimes need to be quite ruthless. For instance, conscript people even in order to achieve legitimate aims. And he considers whether this would render them illegitimate and thus violate their rights to be able to wage war. There's another very interesting book by Christopher Finlay that explores the ethics of war by non-state groups, explores issues for rebels. Again, that's on your handout. This points to a bigger issue, that just war theory needs to be adapted to respond to increased intrastate war. And these two sources are part of a movement in just war theory where increasingly scholars are looking at how to apply notions that typically being used just war theory criteria between two states now to how they apply to civil wars and wars between states and non-state actors. Fourth criterion, formal declaration of war, proper declaration of war sometimes called. This says that those undertaking war must formally and properly declare that they're about to do so. So if a state is to wage war justly, it needs to formally and openly declare that it's going to wage war before the war starts. Another version of this emphasizes that states need to follow parliamentary and constitutional constraints on how the decision to wage war is made. For instance, one of the major criticisms of the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011 was that the war didn't receive the proper authorization from the US Congress as was required under the War Powers Resolution. This War Powers Resolution is supposed to limit the president's ability to wage war without congressional approval. Now, this criterion is often left off the lists, the standard list that you'll find of your cert bellum. This is because it's seen to be only a procedural technicality. Sometimes seen to be anachronistic as well. Why does it matter if a war will be just, why does it matter if a war is going to meet all the other criteria and be just on all the other criteria, whether it's formally announced? In fact, states rarely, if ever, these days formally declare that they're going to go to war. Again, might seem anachronistic. But one way of thinking about it is about the moral relevance of this criterion is to view it as important to receiving proper parliamentary support. It matters on this view that domestic parliaments get to say whether their states choose to wage war or not. So consider, for instance, the debate in the House of Commons about whether the UK should intervene in Syria against Assad in 2013, after Assad had used chemical weapons. The debate was very heated, and at the end, the vote went against waging war. I've got a short video here.
The question before the House today is how to respond to one of the most abhorrent uses of chemical weapons in a century, slaughtering innocent men, women and children in Syria. It is not about taking sides in the Syrian conflict. It is not about invading. It is not about regime change or even working more closely with the opposition. It is about the large-scale use of chemical weapons and our response to a war crime, nothing else.
The weapons inspectors are in the midst of their work and will be reporting in the coming days. That is why today could not have been the day when the House was asked to decide on military action. For this House, it is surely a basic point Evidence should precede decision, not decision precede evidence.
Now, the final decision was widely credited as precluding action by the Obama administration against Assad. Now, we might think that it's important that domestic parliaments get a say in such in a war for two reasons. First, it helps to constrain prime ministers and presidents who may otherwise be too war prone. Second, it helps to ensure that we as citizens are represented in the decisions about whether to go to war. So we can look to MPs' voting records about whether they've supported, for instance, action to wage war in Iraq, in Libya, how they voted on Syria, and so on. We can choose to support them or not on the basis of this. In other words, this can help to ensure what's called the democratic control of force, to ensure that decisions about some of the most important things that we do as a country about going to war are still under democracy. Now on to the fifth criterion. It's often said that war is hell. So consequently, according to this fifth criterion, last resort, war should be the last resort. As I've already mentioned quite a few times, this is central to our module. Again, Iraq War. One of the major criticisms of it was that the weapons inspectors weren't given sufficient time. That war against Saddam was not the last resort, that the US and Brits could have, for instance, sent the inspectors back in again. Now, you might wonder why war has to be the last resort. Suppose that a war could be undertaken very quickly with a surgical strike that doesn't cause many civilian casualties. Suppose that the leading alternative is economic sanctions, comprehensive economic sanctions in particular. As we're going to look at next week, in next week's lecture, comprehensive economic sanctions can cause huge destruction, cause severe harms to civilians. Therefore, you might think it's sometimes better to wage war because the other option is going to be even worse. On this view, war should not always be the last resort. There's another issue too. This is on the literal account of last resort. If one understands last resort literally, then all peaceful means must be tried before war is permissible. So according to Michael Walzer, in his book Arguing About War, there is always something else to do, another diplomatic note, another United Nations resolution, another meeting. You can just continue on. War is therefore never an option if we understand last resort literally. So if we were to endorse last resort literally, then it would lead to a form of pacifism. These problems have led to an amending of how the principle of last resort is being understood in more recent accounts. So the second leading way of understanding it, moving away from this literal account, is what's called the reasonable chance account. This holds that only peaceful options that have a reasonable chance of success should be tried first. This improves upon the literal account, since if, for instance, endless diplomacy will not have a reasonable chance of success, it would not be required to be pursued before war is launched. But the problem with the reasonable chance account is that the options that do have a reasonable chance of success may still be pretty problematic if required to be tried. For instance, if economic sanctions would have a reasonable chance of tackling mass atrocities, but would lead to far more deaths of innocents than a targeted bombing campaign, sanctions would still have to be pursued before war could be permissible. The problem then with a reasonable chance account is it requires insufficient comparison of the costs and benefits of the various options. Measures that are not war are required to only be reasonably effective at addressing the situation, regardless of all the other various problems and issues that they raise, and that we're going to explore later in this module. This brings us to a third understanding of last resort. This holds that war is only permissible if it's going to cause the least amount of harm, if it's the least harmful. Following Simon Caney, we can call this the least awful account. So unlike the reasonable chance account, this account of last resort is sufficiently comparative. It requires that the costs and benefits of the various options be weighed and that the least awful option be chosen. So war can on this account be undertaken ahead of economic sanctions or various diplomatic measures, such as diplomatic criticism that we're going to look at in week 4, if it's the least awful option. So war can be undertaken if it's the least awful option. Now this account seems more attractive, but Eamon Aloyi, whose article is one of the required readings this week, argues that this account is specious. It is because, he claims, it's not really a principle of last resort. It fails to indicate why war, in particular, should be attempted after all the other options have been tried first. There's nothing really about this understanding of last resort that has an element of lastness to it. The potential, all it says is that war can be justifiable when it's the best option. Now, to be clear, this understanding, this least awful account, does say that you should compare war to the alternatives. It just, in doing so, it's losing any claim that war has to be the last thing that we do, or one of the last things that we do. Now, the final criterion of jus ad bellum is fairly straightforward. This says that war must be likely to do more good than harm. Now, the most obvious way of achieving more good than harm is to be victorious. So you might think that we can't wage war without the hope of winning. For instance, think of the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. You might think that on the face of it, the West should have really done something trying to tackle this annexation of Crimea. But there was little hope of being successful, of course, given Russian military power. So in such cases, the principle of proportionality rules out war because war would be futile. There's nothing that could have been done in terms of waging war. But is it enough to be victorious? Is victory enough? Consider the war in Iraq again.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. Be seated, please. Thank you all very much, Admiral Kelly, Captain Card, officers and sailors of the USS Abraham Lincoln, my fellow Americans. Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country. In this battle, we have fought for the cause of liberty and for the peace of the world. Our nation and our coalition are proud of this accomplishment. Yet it is you, the members of the United States military, who achieved it.
Now, of course, this was very hubristic. Bush failed to predict the tragedy that was about to occur and foreseeable, likely to occur. Bush was right that they were victorious in removing Saddam, but the war, it seems caused far more harm than good and could reasonably be foreseen that it was going to. So, according to The Independent, from a few years ago now, there were 179 deaths of UK servicemen and women, over 4,000 US military deaths, Iraqi civilian deaths, estimates range in between 160,000 to 600,000. The cost of the war, estimated to the UK, several billion, 9.6 billion according to The Independent a few years ago, but that's probably gone up. The cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the global war on terror is estimated to cost the US several trillion, in particular when the payments to veterans are taken into account. 3.9 million Iraqi refugees since 2003, of whom 2 million fled the country and 1.9 million were displaced within Iraq. So it doesn't seem that it's enough to focus on the likelihood of achieving victory alone. The principle of proportionality requires that you consider the likelihood of all the potential costs and benefits of war. And once we get a better sense of the costs and benefits, we get a better sense of the critique of war. War can be disproportionate in the following ways. Firstly, excessive internal costs. That is on the state waging war. It can be extremely expensive and result in casualties amongst soldiers and sometimes casualties amongst civilians as well. Secondly, excessive external costs. That is on the other party. It kills enemy soldiers, kills civilians in the target state as well, damages public infrastructure, destroys the economy, harms public health as hospitals are destroyed and there's no money to pay for sophisticated or even basic medical treatment. Excessive costs on third parties. By third parties, I mean other states, other populations, other individuals that might be affected who aren't the belligerents. This includes, most obviously, neighboring states. Neighboring states might be harmed as the war spills over into their borders, or they might have to deal with huge refugee flows that put severe pressure on their public services, and their trade with the target state is likely to be severely diminished, so their economy will be harmed. And more generally, waging war might destabilize the international system and lead to future wars. So sometimes it's suggested that the 1999 intervention in Kosovo that lacked UN Security Council authorization enabled the war in Iraq, which also lacked UN Security Council authorization, and in turn precluded acting robustly in response to the situation in Darfur in 2005 and later on, when there was mass killing. These three categories, internal, external costs and cost to third parties, help us to get a better understanding of why wars might often be deemed disproportionate. I've got another short video here now to illustrate, in particular, category 2, excessive external costs. Now, sometimes the situation might be so bad, if nothing is done, that war could still be justifiable, despite all the potential cost it imposes. And this was increasingly suggested about the situation in Syria. It was claimed that the US or other actors should have acted because, although there might have been very high costs in doing so, the lack of action also has been pretty terrible. So regardless of what you think about this empirical claim, and this contested one, of course, the theoretical point here is important. It's that we need to think not simply about the costs of war, but also about the costs of not waging war. And this is what's emphasized in the principle of proportionality. Sometimes a war might be proportionate, even if it causes significant harm, because it makes the situation better than it would have been. This is known as the counterfactual. So proportionality emphasizes the counterfactual reasoning is required. We need to think about what was likely to have happened or would happen if war is not undertaken. It's an interesting piece by Alex Bellamy on your handout that explores some of these issues. Now, one final point before we end this first part of today's lecture. Sometimes you'll encounter other principles such as reasonable hope of success, very commonly listed in principles of jus ad bellum. I haven't mentioned it today because it's largely viewed as now part of proportionality. And in particular, it's claimed that proportionality should be judged, as I mentioned at the start of this section, with foresight. So we need to think about what's likely to happen, whether war is likely to be successful, likely to do more good than harm. And so isn't really a separate principle. So if you come across a principle of reasonable prospects of success, view it as part of proportionality. Okay, to recap this first part of the lecture. Accounts of jus ad bellum typically include 6 criteria that need to be met before war can be justified. If then there needs to be just cause, those prosecuting need to have the right intention and legitimate authority to do so. They need to publicly declare that they are going to war, and war needs to be the last resort and proportionate. Now, you might think actually that some of these principles aren't really that important, or you might think that they should be understood differently. In the seminars next week, we're going to look more closely at some of the justifications behind these principles. But it's worth noting that sometimes it's held that war doesn't need to meet all of these principles in order to be justified by just war theorists. For instance, you might not think that formal declaration of war or legitimate authority needs to be met for a war to be justified. It might be desirable that these are met, but it's not necessary. Okay, this brings to an end the first part of today's lecture.